Okay, so we're talking Israelis Sing Europe. We're going to be looking at three different songs where Israelis talk about this whole idea of Israelis leaving Israel in order to live in Europe, and in particular, in this song, in order to live in Berlin, the capital of Germany. So this is a song, Berlin, by Shmemel, and the photograph by Stefan Widua on Unsplash. Credit to Stefan. So it all began with the Milky protest. That was the way in which it was connotated in the media. It all emerged when Israelis who had gone to visit Berlin found out that local products that were made in Israel were more expensive in Israel than as export, and that they found that just prices in Israel were incredibly high, even for stuff which had been created locally. And you could actually get, for example, you know, that those yellow croutony things that they call soup almonds or something by Osem are cheaper in New Jersey than they are in Israel when they're actually made in Israel. This is some 3 years after there'd been a whole popular protest against prices. There was a realization that nothing had actually changed. So this protest began, and together with this protest came this call to just leave Israel and go to live in Berlin. A group was set up online, the Olim LeBerlin. We're going to emigrate up to Berlin. As opposed to Olim LeBerlin, which means to go up to Berlin, there were others who were just talking about leaving Israel. And they brought out a meme which said, waiter, there's a fly in my country, as opposed to in my soup. And they say, don't let them mess with your head. Just as you'd exchange your soup if it had a fly in it, it's completely your right to move on and exchange your country that has something rotten inside it. And this rottenness, according to these activists, was the way in which prices and price controls in Israel and monopolies in Israel mean that the standard citizen ends up having to pay out far more than he or she ordinarily would in any other country in the world. This was satirized by many. Shai Chalka took the Danube Holocaust Memorial and added a few Milky cartons to it. And the largest critic was the new finance minister, Yair Lapid, and he responded to questions about these folks who were wanting to go to live in Berlin. He said, a word for all those who've had enough and are leaving for Europe. You happen to have caught me in Budapest. I came here to give a speech to the parliament against anti-Semitism and to remind them how they attempted to murder my father here only because Jews did not have a country of their own. How they murdered my grandfather in a concentration camp, how they starved my uncles, and how my grandmother was saved from the march of death at the last minute. So you'll forgive me if I have little tolerance for people who are willing to throw the only country the Jews have into the garbage because Berlin is more comfortable. It's the kind of comment from a politician that artists just have to respond to. And Shmemel were among the first. I recommend you go listen to the song right now, and we'll carry on talking about it later. Up in the top right of the screen, you've got a little eye, and you can click on that to get to the video, and the link is also down in the comments. So the chorus is a cracker. As you can hear, it's describing Berlin as if it were Jerusalem and using that holy language of Jerusalem in a beautifully cynical and provocative kind of way. I mean, in particular, check this out. Even if I should forget my right hand. I mean, this is the prayer that you even say under the chuppah, under the wedding canopy when you're about to get married. You say, if I forget thee, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning. And instead of talking about Jerusalem, Shmemel are talking about Berlin. It's an outrage. And then they carry on with Reichstag of peace and of euro and of light, which is a deliberate and sneaky and hilarious reference to Jerusalem of Gold, the ultimate iconic song of Jerusalem. Jerusalem of gold and of copper and of light. For all your songs I am a liar. And here they say, for all your songs I don't have a passport. And this whole idea, even playing on not only of euro and of light, but note it's saying Reichstag, of peace, as opposed to gold. I don't need your gold. I could do with some peace. So all these ways in which Shmemel is really digging into the mythology of the higher Israel, of the higher reasons why we should be living in Israel, and applying it to Berlin. They just massacre the sacred cows. So, for example, more massacring of the sacred cows that you may well have picked up on. As he says, the neighbour, she's been living in LA 15 years already, says that it's best to close the eye looking forward. What's he talking about? He is actually referring to close your eyes to the national anthem. In Hatikva says, Ein Letzion Sophia, the eye looks forward towards Zion. And he's saying, nah, don't do that anymore. Close that eye, and then you can enjoy life in LA, for example. And then the sacred cow, which is even larger, when he says, let's be honest, Grandma and Grandpa didn't come here out of Zionism. They fled here because they didn't want to die. And the guy has a point, right? Because a lot of people did come to Israel, not necessarily out of some huge ideological desire, other than that this was the place which felt safe because of so much anti-Semitism, pogroms and Holocaust in Europe and oppression around the world. Many people fled to Israel and did not come out of the Zionism that we've learnt from, for example, songs by Naomi Shemer. And by the end, we're moving beyond facetiousness and more to some deep-lying anger about leaders who want us to stay isolated, stay frightened, because the whole world hates Jews. The song talks about the way in which they feel that Israeli leaders are deliberately trying to persuade them that the Holocaust is just around the corner, and therefore one must never leave, and if you leave Israel, you are a traitor to the people. Once again, they pin on me the yellow star like a medal of honor, like a flower in the lapel, as if it's something to be proud of. And the song is talking about moving beyond or even forgetting the past and just going where you can live your life as opposed to get by. And at the same time, there's a sadness in the song. I actually don't want any place else, he says. It's cold there, it's strange there, and Hebrew's the only language that I love to speak. And this whole idea that ideally they wouldn't be going off to Berlin. He wouldn't be praising Berlin. He'd rather stay here because this is home. And then the final flip in the tail. But how can I ignore the fact that my children would have to be in a place that chased off Dudu Zal? Dudu Zal was a very famous children's entertainer on TV. Par Nechmad was his major show, which everybody grew up on. And Dudu Zal now lives in California and has left Israel. And overall, I'm just left with this whole feeling of how it's really cheeky. It's very chutzpahdik. It's shouting back at the grown-ups. And at the same time, the video is so Israeli. It's so cute. All these Israelis who are elsewhere with their kids, just having fun around the world and dancing along to a fun and cheeky Israeli song. And a few questions for you to consider. What do you feel when you learn of Israelis leaving Israel for mostly financial reasons? What does that leave in you? I know that certainly for certain generations this would bring about a sadness. Do you feel a disappointment? Do you feel that it's just no issue when you learn there are Israelis leaving Israel for mostly financial reasons? And would you feel differently if an Israeli Jew were to move to anywhere in the world, or if they move to Germany? Is there something obviously Holocaust-based that makes you feel differently about an Israeli moving to Germany, to Berlin, rather than anywhere else? So the final verse seems to hint at a sadness and a love of Israel and its culture. Do you ever find yourself loving your country's culture and wishing you were living somewhere else at the same time? This has been brought to you by Makom, the Israel Education Lab of the Jewish Agency, in a project in partnership with Moishe House, which has been very generously funded by the Jim Joseph Foundation. I hope you look out for more songs where Israelis sing Europe.